Hi, I'm Ken Cook, and I'm having another episode. These do happen to me with regularity. This one is prompted by a book. And kids, I want to encourage you to try this at home. It's this book by a wonderful author, Austin Frerick, who's my guest today. Austin is an expert on agricultural and antitrust policy. During the 2020 presidential campaign, he advised Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Pete Buttigieg on agricultural policy. He ultimately served as co-chair of the Biden campaign's Agriculture Antitrust Policy Committee, and we're going to find out what happened to that. He now works at Yale University, collaborating on research related to competition policy and antitrust enforcement, which we don't talk enough about, I think, when we talk about our problems with the food system. His book, his first book, debut book, is Barron's: Money, Power, and the Corruption of America's Food Industry. And he profiles a whole series of magnates, barons, to illustrate the concentration of power in the American food system. And I'm excited to talk to you today, Austin, about your book, your perspective. You come to this not just as an author, but as someone who's gotten his hands a little dirty with the actual politics of trying to make something happen. I'd love to explore that a little bit with you. But you start the book and you come to this as an Iowa boy. And the perspective you bring to it is the perspective of someone, you might say nostalgic, but to me, I have some of the same perspective growing up in Missouri next door and seeing the changes that have happened to agriculture there. So welcome. Tell me a little bit about what it means to you personally to see what's happened, observe what's happened in your home state of Iowa.
Well, thanks for having me on, Ken. And honestly, I find Iowa both sad and heartbreaking and angry. It's like this combination of emotions of this
Yeah.
should be the Italy of North America. This should be the Napa Valley for food tourism. But
Yep.
it's the second highest cancer rate in the country. It's one of the most obese states. It's so broken. And you see what the system could be because you meet people doing it right. But then you just look around you and to me, it almost looks like the New Jersey Turnpike. It's just so industrial. And the countryside doesn't feel like the countryside. I mean, working on this book for 5 years, the book originally started off as angry. And the more I kind of simmered in it, it just became more sad, that opening section.
Yeah. It's interesting. A dear friend and former colleague, Craig Cox, who was a vice president at EWG for many years, and I think one of the leading thinkers at the intersection of agriculture and the environment, going way back at the National Academy and at USDA and then in the Senate. And he used to describe springtime in Iowa, and he was based in Iowa for a while and then Minnesota, as a construction site. Seeing what happens to the landscape as it is tilled and sprayed and endlessly drained as being so different from the Iowa of some not so long ago, but now some decades ago, I think, fair to say, where you had smaller fields, you still had some trees on the landscape. I always tell people, if you're wondering about an agricultural landscape and whether there's a measure of diversification, look for fences.
Yes.
And if there's no fences, there's no animals. Is that how you experience it when you go back? Because a lot of people don't have an eye for it. You see vast areas of green corn. For a lot of people, that in the summertime, that seems like, well, that's nature.
I kind of compare it to like a lobster boiling in a pot. Like most Iowans don't realize that fence thing. It wasn't until a farmer pointed it out to me, and now I notice it all the time. I mean, the other thing I think about in Iowa is growing up, living there, you don't go in the water in the spring. That's when the nitrate levels are usually the highest. Usually the beaches are closed, which I know the phrase Iowa beaches was kind of funny.
Hey, I'm from Missouri. We love Midwestern beaches.
No, I know. I'm married to my partner's from the East Coast, so he always likes to mock me for that.
Damn these ocean people.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I don't like salt water. I mean, that's a whole different conversation.
Well, that's the flaw of the ocean, I think. It's salt. It's so salty. And a lot of sand on their beaches. I don't know.
I know, but they have fries on the shore. But in Iowa, it gets worse and worse every year, but it does it incrementally, so you don't really notice it. Even like animals on land, that's when I really dairy cows didn't disappear, but it happened slowly. Like, so part of my family's from
Yeah.
Northeast Iowa, and that traditionally was dairy country. It's really hilly, hard to do row crops.
Yep.
And we'd go up there and it's not like everyone went bankrupt all of a sudden. It's just the numbers came tighter and tighter. And like, you can't compete on price against these industrial dairy models out in the desert. So people, they tell their kids not to go into it. And then they eventually, mom and dad close up shop. And you also got to be careful of romanticizing the past. But
Sure.
so much of an Iowa is like, I just remember you play games, you would see dairy cows, and then now you don't. You smell animals, but you don't see them.
This brings us into the structure of the book, which I found fascinating and very helpful, of how these various segments of the food system, coffee, dairy, meat, and so on, came to be dominated by just a very small number of what you call barons. Talk about some of the sectors that you looked at, Austin, and which one was the one that freaked you out the most?
I'm glad you asked about how I structure this book, because Ken, I worked on this book for 5 years, and it took me 2 or 3 years to figure out how to tell this story. I mean, my first job in DC was at the Congressional Research Service.
Mine too.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
I was at CRS in 76. Yeah. That's where I learned about agricultural policy.
Wow, I didn't know. I literally have a whole cabinet full of CRS reports behind me. I thought it was like one of the best policy training grounds, because it's almost like, in psychology, where you see professors or academics study children. That's kind of how I view CRS with the Hill.
Yeah, exactly.
My brain is structural. And so part of this stems from, I never thought there was a good book out there that explained the Farm Bill in like a common sense speak. And I get this from my dad, and I think it's partly being a first generation college student, of so much language of this era is designed to wall people off. So how can I show people structural stories? And I really love George Packer's book, Great Unwinding, from like 10, 15 years ago.
For sure.
Yeah, such a brilliant structure of how he showed inequality, what it means from a society standpoint. So I kept playing around with that. And then I actually kind of realized I'm not the biggest fan of this book, but I think it's an interesting structure, which was John Kennedy's Profiles in Courage. Mm-hmm. So I kind of joke that I did the inverse Profiles in Courage. Because it's what I realized is this robber baron thing. It's a powerful framework to hook people, because like every baron's really built around a structural story. And like for me, the sector I found the most interesting, and I think is really the thesis of the book, is my coffee baron.
Yeah.
Because it's really about monopoly. And like, especially at this moment, my big point is monopolist finance fascist. And the collapse of those guardrails has really ushered in the second Gilded Age that's rampant in the food system.
Yeah. And it's monopoly by acquisition, right? It's not like they grew up on coffee plantations and decided to get big from those roots. It's more like, hey, this shit's profitable.
They entered America in 2012. I mean, that's what's wild is they bought all these companies: Pret, Caribou, Coffee, Einstein's Bagels, Noah's Bagels, Keurig Cups, Stumptown, Krispy Kremes, tons more. And here's the thing, they would not be able to have done this just a few decades ago, when we had this a robust antitrust framework. But with the collapse of that, they essentially did the private equity strategy of, they saw a competitive market, they rolled it up. It's really about squeezing the coffee farmers. It's collapsing that spot market for the coffee farmers, which honestly, that unleashes a whole can of migration too, that's underappreciated in the food system. But what's really fascinating about that family, it's a secret German family. They have a really dark history to the Nazis. I mean, the family was early support of Hitler. They believed in all that. They engaged in slave labor. I use their story to tell this bigger story of like, lost history was after World War II, Congress Commission report, how did this happen? And when their key findings were monopolist finance fascists. The American government actually broke up a lot of the cartels in Japan and Europe that financed them, including IG Farben. Like, Hitler's largest donor was a chemical company. And people might know of IG Farben today because one of the companies it was broken up into was Bayer Monsanto.
Yeah, of course. I love that the coffee baron, that the name of the baron is JAB Holdings, JAB Holdings. It sounds perfect for dehumanizing, depersonalizing something that you think of as the most human of experiences, which is having a nice cup of coffee.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said human experiences, because like, this was a really hard chapter to write, actually, because it's not linear. I literally go from Panera to Nazis to talk about my mom's bakery. And part of the reason why I wanted to talk about my mom's bakery, I want to show that human side and like what we've lost. And I call this Excel thinking, like this whole consultant world we live in right now, that's, you can't put human existence, human values into Excel. People came to my mom's coffee shop because the relationship she built with them, and she was part of the community. She gave back to community, and that's been lost in this era. And I think It's been underappreciated because it's the local businesses, local farms that maintain culture, perpetuate culture. This homogenization of everything is just kind of stripped us of that.
Yeah, for sure. In situ, in the Midwest and in the other places where these barons have such a heavy imprint, the jobs go away too, the quality jobs, the opportunity to stay in a rural area, and that creates kind of a substrate for hopelessness, and that can move people pretty quickly into a authoritarian desires and yearnings. I thought that was a really profound observation you had, tying what's happened as a result of these anti-competitive giant controlling interests. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really soul crushing. And I think also just being from Iowa, I mean, if there's regions in America to study the politics of these last few decades, is the collapse of Democrat support in like the upper Midwest and rural communities. I mean,
Yeah,
that dairy country in Northeast Iowa, that was all those rural counties Obama won twice. And then you just see
yeah,
what used to be family farmers are now low wage workers. We shouldn't be shocked to see them gravitate towards the strongman. And at the same time, too, I know people talk a lot about the state of American media, but it's really collapsed in these rural areas. I mean, the
oh my
Des
gosh,
Moines
yeah.
Register used to be one of the best papers in America, and now it's a shell of itself. And it's just there's so many of these stories and this pain, this anger, just not being told and captured. And I mean, I see this in my own family. So much of a newspaper was creating community, selling the both sides, finding the middle ground, and now these platforms reward anger. It rewards division, and it's just to me one of the big books here that shaped me too was this great book called Politics of Resentment.
Wonderful book.
Wonderful. And people talk about inequality, but people don't talk about regional inequality. Like so much of the gains have been concentrated of this, this era have been concentrated in a few cities. Rural America really hasn't experienced that. But even cities, it's different. And, for every booming Austin, Texas, there's a St. Louis. St. Louis is a
Yeah.
shell of its former self. All of its companies, major companies got it consolidated out.
You mentioned the media angle here. We struggle with it as a nonprofit, and we're very good at getting media for our work. But when you find yourself pitching and there's no one there to catch it, that's when you know you're in a different world. And the Des Moines Register is a great example. I don't think they have a bureau in Washington
No.
anymore. A lot of newspapers don't have bureaus. They used to have it in George Anthony. James Risser won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and he was the bureau chief. I got to know him very well over the years. And so when you don't have journalists picking up rocks and looking underneath them, you really are at a disadvantage to these big corporate interests who are more than happy to see all these nosy journalists go away.
Yes.
And I think that's part of why it's very difficult to have these civil conversations, because there's no common document that you can argue over and talk about. As you say, we're all guilty of it, I suppose. Migrate to the media sources that reinforce what you think. And the Des Moines Register is a perfect example of they used to have the best agricultural policy coverage in the country. I think now it's very difficult for them to justify as a journalism operation covering agriculture that much.
I think the best example of this point you're making plays out in my Dairy Baron chapter.
Yeah.
I mean, they got so much press and copy for being industry leaders on climate stuff in the dairy sector. And you go to where their dairy farm is about an hour south of Gary, Indiana. Right away, Ken, I was like, there's something wrong here. I've never seen canals around cornfields in the Midwest before. And you just go to Wikipedia and you're like, oh, this used to be a wetland. This was Everglades. Like Teddy
Yeah.
Roosevelt used to go hunting here. You should not be doing row cropping here. But it goes to show you, I mean, like, you had a lot of elite food publications run with their narrative. And I don't want to shame the journalists, but just the rates have collapsed, the freelance rates. And part of the story I really wanted to tell with them is I was obsessed with explaining to the reader what a checkoff is. I think
Yeah.
checkoffs control the conversation over the food system in America. For your listeners out there that don't know what they are, it's these things literally go back to the New Deal, where farmers would literally vote to check a box to essentially pay a tax, advertise their good. These things really didn't matter up until the 80s. But as we're overproducing a few things, the goal of these checkoffs became, how do we get you to buy additional? It's like, how do we get you to eat more ice cream? It's like Got Milk was coming out of it. But what these checkoffs realize is these campaigns really didn't work. So I argue, and you guys have done a really good job highlighting this, is it's financing a lot of junk science.
That's right.
Oh, so many of these journalists, I mean, I shouldn't even say journalists. So much agricultural news ecosystem in America lives off checkoff money. So much of them now are just corporate PR.
No, that's right. They're trade publications, a lot of great journalists working for those trade publications. But by definition, to survive in that world, you can't be antagonizing your sources. You can't be telling the counter story, or your calls don't get returned. And so you see this collapse into a combination of lots of copy extolling the powers that be and going to the same conventions together, sometimes funded by the same sponsors. And it doesn't make for the kind of scrutiny that we need. What is your sense of how folks in the Midwest, for example, how do they receive this critique? I mean, one of the powers, I think, of these barons is that they've been able to make these enormously controlling structures matters of civic pride and acceptance in some places. Like the great story you tell about the hog barons in chapter one, a family farm operation is how it started. They're extolled now by everyone from governors of Iowa on down as this is the success story. This is what we should be proud of here in Iowa. And there obviously are their communities fighting against these giant confinements that make it unlivable in big parts of Iowa due to the smell and the flies and the lagoon waste that's being spread over fields, make it unlivable. And there are plenty of people fighting for moratoriums on building more of them. Mostly they've lost. But there's this real sort of boosterism that I feel like a lot of people in the Midwest embrace. What's your sense of that, Austin?
There's like two things true of one, sorry, a little conflicting, but I find interesting. What's been really fascinating to me is actually how well this book has been doing in like conservative media. Like the American Conservative gave me a great recommendation or book review saying every conservative should read this. That's also very intentional of mine. Like I really want a Big Ten approach. I love playing with rhetoric.
Of course.
And using this kind of Teddy Roosevelt thing, I think plays well in the meat markets, the meat world. You got to go. I mean, one of my favorite moments so far in the book press these last few months was I thought I was calling to a public radio in a small town in Iowa, Burlington, Iowa. And it turns out I was on a Shock Jock AM radio. Oh, Ken, it was a who. I, for the life of me, I wish I recorded it. And keep in mind, I was in a Boise hotel. It was 7 a.m. I was not I was giving an academic talk. I was not expecting this. They started coming after me and like saying Iowa doesn't have a water crisis and manure. And like, the worst that you can tell a former CRS person is they don't know what they're talking about, or their sources is not correct.
Yes, your facts are wrong.
Like nothing gets me going more than that. I have 1,000 citations in a 200-page book, and that is for a reason. And we were going at it. And the funniest part was all 3 callers to that AM radio station were on my side. They all started the same way by an old man. I don't normally agree with blank, but he's really right about meatpacking. That to me says something. At the same time, too, and I think this especially from an Iowa Midwest context, is I don't think people on the coast have really appreciate the degree of Stockholm syndrome in these communities.
Yes, that's right.
Most of these communities fought power and they lost. And they do not want to talk about it. As someone told me straight up, life gets complicated. You can't afford to leave. I mean, your home is your everything. It's your wealth in America. Home values in these areas are essentially flat, maybe up in the last few decades. Your kids might move to Minneapolis or Des Moines. You can't afford to move there. So these towns, these rural areas become basically retirement homes and those students who couldn't make the jump. And actually that's why when I read the Hog chapter 2, I have a lot of anger with Secretary Vilsack.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing with everyone likes to hold up Earl Butz, Secretary Nixon's USDA secretary is like the villain, but he never pretended to be your friend. Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? He looked at you in the eye and said, get out.
Yeah.
Vilsack is like Harold Hill, the music man. He'll tell you what you want to hear, but his word means absolutely nothing. I'm glad that joke worked. Ken, certain crowds, it doesn't work. I used it at a college lecture the other day and like, oh my God, they went right over the kids' heads and they don't know The Simpsons. So I couldn't even use the monorail man reference. But that's what's really detrimental to Vilsack was like his reelection campaign as governor of Iowa in 2002 was centered on these hog confinements. I mean, you had a true rural rebellion in Iowa, people not wanting this to happen. And his main opponent was the head lobbyist from my hog baron. And Vilsack ran ads promising to do something. And the way Iowa works, because of something he voted for as state senator, only the governor of Iowa can stop the construction confinements. Well, then after he won, not only did he not do anything, he oversaw the largest expansion of confinements in Iowa history.
Yeah.
And that is just that breaks people in a way that's like, when you work so hard, You're barely getting by. Life is not good. To elect someone, not only did they not deliver, but then to actually undermine what you're trying to do, it's just people give up. And that's like what I've really
Yeah.
seen in rural communities is even if you use this rhetoric of breaking up companies, people don't believe you until you put points on the board. And to be fair, they should, because there's been so much hollow rhetoric about doing something about the meat markets. Even now, I mean, the fact is the last 4 years, the meat markets have gotten more concentrated under Secretary Vilsack. Even though he's talking all this, reality says otherwise.
So, a lot of books about what's not working in our food system immediately go to we need to reform the Farm Bill. We need to make changes in the Clean Water Act and regulate these operations. We need to have more farmers markets, more local food, and so forth. But what you've done is stepped back and said, we're not going to really deal with the food system until we go to these root problems of competitiveness and antitrust policy that are kind of neglected. And they're certainly, I won't say neglected because I don't know the full landscape of the advocacy community in these areas. But I do know, as someone who has a lot of people working on Capitol Hill and in agencies every day back in DC, I do know that there's not an abundance of advocacy resources and assets that is focused on competitiveness and antitrust policy. That's kind of seen as good government work that foundations don't find sexy anymore. Give me your sense of what has happened to all the promises that we, were expecting when, Mr. Vilsack got his third, I guess, shot at being secretary.
The really scary thing with his failure to do anything meaningful here is it's very clear this election outcome will come down to a few suburban voters in a few key states. And it's going to be driven by grocery store prices. And industry loves to say cheap food, cheap food. When you actually pull USDA's own data, that's not true. So industry, this is the CRS person in me, will always say percent of income. You cannot use percent
Yeah.
of income when our inequality is this high in this country, this bifurcated. If you use per capita, we spend more than a lot of Western democracies. We're about dollar for dollar for Italy, which, by the way, we shouldn't be shocked. Concentrated markets gouge. It's what they do. Vilsack at his core is an industrial dairy lobbyist. That's what he was between administrations, and that's what he wants to do again. And everything, all his behavior shows someone who doesn't want to actually grapple with power, who wants the soundbite but doesn't want to do anything structural and meaningful. And to me, the saddest thing here is you had a chance for a Democrat to outflank Republicans, call bluff on all their talk about doing something about the meat markets. But also, there's a playbook here. I mean, when you learn about monopolies in school, meat's usually the one you study. I mean, we're not talking AI, we're not
Yeah.
talking about search engines, we're talking about hogs. That to me is a sad thing. So his whole theory of change was let's dump $1 billion of taxpayer money against startups to essentially dislodge these dominant players. Which, first of all, you start with JBS. I mean, JBS is my slaughter bear in my book. They are the closest thing
Yeah.
we have to a criminal organization in corporate America. I mean, that rhetoric sounds over the top, but like when you look at the facts, they pled guilty to bribing over 1,600 Brazilian politicians. And I'm not even talking campaign contributions. I'm talking about bribes, like Manhattan apartment level
Bribes, yeah.
bribes. The simple notion that you think they're going to give up an ounce of market share is just, it's not even stupid. It's just like the willful ignorance is just like not acceptable. Like if you think that, then you shouldn't be in that job. If you think that company's going to give you an ounce of market share. On top of it, they've done nothing to expand market access for these new companies to get onto the shelves of these spaces. So at best, most of these new slaughterhouses will just be a new premium brand product for like the 1% of Americans who go to Whole Foods or whatever. You're not doing anything for the Walmart consumer, the Walmart shopper. But big tech antitrust people have been incredibly effective. I mean, the appointment
Yeah.
of Commissioner Lena Khan, I would argue, is one of President Biden's maybe best local appointments. What a game changer. I mean, this was a marginal group
Yeah.
that basically one or two foundations financed, 7, 8 years ago. I mean, full disclosure, I come out of that world. That's what I kind of did after Treasury and CRS. I was at open markets. No one's ever going to give you a seat at the table. You have to fight for it. And especially in
That's right.
the spaces, you have to put on a show. I mean, I think political theater has been lost. There are roles for good reports, but a good report's not going to change the minds of USDA officials. I was just at a big conference of civic-minded people in Minneapolis the other day, and I told people, USDA has tons of political appointees. Pick out a few and demand people in your orbit get those positions. you're not going to teach an industrial dairy lobbyist how to do the right thing this late in the game. Your goal is to get one of you in the room.
Yeah, and that takes advocacy organizations that have staying power, who, can support staff that know how to play that, that game. It's increasingly difficult to play if you are relying on the media. It's harder than it looks, with a few exceptions. We still don't have, it seems like, the advocacy muscle, the depth of it that we might need. So much so that they've actually threatened some of the folks in the tech world, and they've pushed back so hard they're moving over to Trump now. That's when you can tell you're drawing a little bit of blood, but we don't see that in the agriculture world, right?
That, and also, I mean, there will be a book written one day of just how ruthless these big tech antitrust people were behind the scenes. I mean, she just didn't get that appointment. I mean, there was an intentional effort to construct her as a hero. She had a great New York Times profile a few years ago. At the same time, too, other people were under consideration. And it just so happens their dirt was published in other news outlets. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
These companies hire the best and brightest. You got to play ball. I mean, that's actually what I tell a lot of activists in Iowa is see something, say something. I mean, I'm pretty open about this, where Secretary Vilsack's son left a job at the most elite law firm in Iowa to go work for one of these carbon pipeline companies in the state, which I think you guys done reports on this, where their goal is to capture the gas from ethanol, take it to North Dakota and bury it underground and use it for fracking and call it climate change.
Yes.
Is someone to go work for an ethanol baron to build that. And this thing is only economically viable if daddy delivers. I let a reporter know this. A friend of mine tipped me off to this in Des Moines, and I just said something. It's that type of corruption that really bothers people. And you just got to play ball that way. When they released their meat antitrust plan, I said it was a joke. I said it's like giving $1 billion to Ask Jeeves saying good luck against Google.
Well, as you probably know, we have filed a complaint against all the claims that are being made for climate-friendly beef.
But your guys' work on there is incredible, because it's also, to me, very scary. This is what I expect under Trump, to have USDA saying Tyson's is climate smart beef in Nebraska on a feedlot. I don't expect under a Democrat president.
Yeah.
That's how broken, or like how radical things have gotten. I mean, that's like truly one of the key takeaways I want from my book is the system we have now is radical. It's radical that we're saying a beef feedlot in Nebraska is good for the climate.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, the story about the pipeline going up to the Dakotas to make fracking of gas more efficient. Am I really reading this in a newspaper, or is this the Onion's website?
I have to fight my Midwesternness where you try to be polite. But when people say this stuff, I just say, do you believe the world is flat? That's what it is. If you think ethanol is good for the climate in 2024, you think the world's flat. There's no conversation here.
Yeah.
We're just wasting time. The climate crisis is just getting worse. And agriculture is the second largest contributor to it. And we've done nothing, like nothing of substance. Like you can't do more industrial dairy production for cheese and ice cream in these areas and say it's good for the climate when you're solving a problem of their own making. It's just this rampant greed, this gluttony, this second gilded ageness that is just, it's just destructive. And also like the whole undercurrent too of my book, which I didn't appreciate until the end, is it also makes just bad tasting food.
There is that.
Yeah. I mean, I do little tastings. Like turns out cows in the desert eating corn in a metal shed don't taste as good as, cows on pasture. That's what's been lost too, is we're paying more for junk. And people notice it, especially older Americans really notice of just how bad quality has gotten some of these food products. I mean, I noticed it in pork. Industrial pork is just garbage compared to like traditional pork.
Yeah, it's a race between memory and dying taste buds to be able to detect that as you age. But absolutely, and it goes to the resentment questions in rural America, that the people who now have access to higher quality food that differentiates from what's offered to most people in the country and what most people can afford are, people who live in far away from where the food is produced still. But by and large, people are paying the price in multiple ways. They deal with the pollution, they deal with the job loss, and then they get the bad food on top.
My book is like Lowkeyia rejection of, you don't change a system with your fork. You just bifurcate it more, like you said. You change systems by changing systems. You change structures. Like my goal is to improve.
Yeah, you can't get away from that.
You can't. And like my goal is to improve the food quality of Dollar General. That's what I care about. I don't care about another Whole Foods thing. Also, Whole Foods is not even what it used to be. That's like the funny thing of this all. All these premium brands have essentially been, they get bought by a bigger thing and then they get gutted.
Get acquired.
Yep. And the quality collapses, or like it's a fraction of what it used to be. So Walmart's my grocery baron. And I realized writing that chapter is the creation of one robber baron makes other robber barons. So like Driscoll's became a baron because they realized with the rise of Walmart, Walmart wants one company to do 4 berries year round for 4,000 stores. They don't want to source a different berry for each store. So you see, in order to have leverage or buying power, you see consolidation across the food system because everyone's trying to essentially keep up. And what's really wild about Walmart, and I actually, like, when I put this book together, they weren't in the original plan. I feel like a lot of Walmart writing is just like kind of classist. It didn't feel new to me. But I also never thought of them as a grocery store, to be honest. But once you start digging into it, you're like, oh, not only are they the richest family in America, the largest private employer, they are at a scale we've never seen before in the food system. I just kept having grocery people tell me with Walmart, it's supply and command. And I kept thinking, oh, they're the closest thing we've ever had in America to a Soviet Union style Politburo, which is just kind of wild to think about. You know what I mean? Like, to me, the most powerful person in the food system right now is a Walmart buyer. If they want green beans grown in Argentina, well, by golly, the green beans will be grown in Argentina. If they want cattle to be smaller, butchered earlier in life, then by golly, they'll be butchered earlier in life.
Yep.
Also, it's why you don't see innovation anymore. I mean, you don't see new food companies, new brands. It's really just like a new version of Oreos anymore. Local company, your local store is going to help them do one store, then maybe 2 or 3, 4 or 5. No one can scale that fast for Walmart unless you have, Wall Street behind you. And at the same time, too, to do these supply chains and to make them really long and homogenous, you lose that regionalness in the American diet and our cuisines when these supply chains become like that. Because it's all about moving as much processed food.
Yeah. Dream up for me. Help me dream up an advocacy campaign that would take on in the food system these important issues of antitrust and competitiveness policy. What would the agenda look like? And maybe apply it to one of your barren industries, barren dominated sectors. What infrastructure would we need? What kind of capabilities? I'm asking for a friend here, and a friend might be someone in a foundation. But what about going into the bowels of anti-competitiveness policy and antitrust policy? What would that look like, Austin?
There's 2 ideas that come to my mind, 2 campaigns. One's like in DC, kind of insider campaign, one's an outsider campaign. My insider campaign is gun for the undersecretary for regulatory programs, the person who oversees checkoffs and GIPSA. USDA is unique where the FTC and DOJ have most antitrust authority except in meatpacking. That's over at USDA under what used to be called GIPSA that Trump gutted. That undersecretary has so much power. I would really gun for that position and get a reformer into that, because that you will not get any meaningful food reforms in America until you deal with the checkoffs. I mean, the checkoffs are a slush fund that no one oversees. I mean, the amount of self-dealing I've heard from people privately. I mean, the dairy program alone, about a $600 million pot of money, that there are countless GAO reports out there saying just how much lack of oversight there is. So to me, it's doing an advocacy campaign to really put someone in that position of power. The second thing, and like it's an idea I wrestled with for the last 2 years, and I'm feeling much more cemented in it now, is I think reformers should join with the Heritage and the Cato folks to kill the modern farm bill. I don't see any reason to maintain it. I think the current modern farm bill is worse for the climate. It institutionalizes industrial meat and dairy production, the confinement model. I'm not talking about SNAP. I'm talking about the crop insurance commodity programs, conservation. And the fact that conservation now is used to finance hog manure lagoons tells you how broken it is. And the dirty secret is Big Ag hollowed out its voter base. I mean, this whole coalition is rooted in 1960s America, and the suburbs aren't not even part of that conversation. I don't see why reformers should be carrying weight to maintain this really gluttonous, broken system. Because keep in mind, this system is designed to overproduce grains at the expense of everything else. So produce doesn't get $1, but if I want to grow as much corn as possible, that's what the system does. And that's what I think a campaign should be. I've been floating this idea to different organizations lately. Everyone's just so risk adverse. Every year we lose and we lose more ground. We got to try something different.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like kind of the FDR thing of play on the train you can win on. We cannot win in this current farm bill. I mean, so much people celebrate these little, we got a pilot program. And you're like, great, that's 0.1% of the farm bill budget.
Tell me about it. Yeah. Yeah.
It's the thing that's really, I mean, again, going back to my mom's New Deal Catholicism, is how much welfare these industrial grain farmers want in crop insurance, yet at the same time, too, they want to cut the food assistance. You know what I mean? How selfish is that? It's so repulsive.
You know, we've been in that fight for decades now. I mean, for many years, for example, we made the case that in the Farm Bill, our top priority as an environmental group was SNAP, was maintaining those benefits. We reasoned you really can't, on the one hand, be worried about kids being exposed to pesticides or other toxic chemicals in their food if they don't have food. And even though the benefit structure is such that it doesn't necessarily encourage nutrition, there needs to be a baseline benefit for these parents to be able to feed their kids. We have also had considerable success. My colleague Scott Faber has been brilliant at this, bringing in the kinds of conservative organizations you mentioned in our approach to farm subsidies and crop insurance. I think we probably are the leading group that's raising questions about that. There are a few others out there, but they don't usually have the firepower. They haven't put the names and the amounts of farm subsidy recipients online as we've did for the past 20 years or so. Going hard at that, it's very difficult to attract support from the foundation community. Most of the ones that supported us early on have decided it's hopeless. To your point, you break your pick enough and you start looking for softer places to dig. And I think that has discouraged advocacy and discouraged building up the infrastructure that we need to take on these competitiveness issues fundamentally at the core that are making it difficult to win anything but victories on the margins.
Yeah.
In our work in conservation, we recognize the flaws in these programs that we helped build, and we talk about them. We talk about, hey, guess what? We lost. They're spending too much money on spray nozzles and calling it sustainable agriculture. This is not what anyone should have had in mind when we supported conservation programs. I think your book can really serve as a roadmap for the advocacy community, and I hope for those who support the advocacy community to try and reframe and reorient our priorities so that we are trying to take on these core fights and not skirmishing around the edges, winning small victories. Nothing wrong with small victories, but we should always call them small if they're small.
Yeah.
We shouldn't exaggerate their importance.
I mean, I've noticed it personally. So many of these foundations have given up kind of on real America. They blame it for Trump. But that's why I've been very intentional in framing this. It's not just about the farmer. It's about those who work it, process it, cook it, transport it, deliver it. People like my mom and dad. And once you talk of it that way,
Yeah.
you're talking about 1 in 10 of Americans. And it's mostly female and it's mostly non-white.
It's a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a lot of people. And people crave positive vision right now. That's what I've really noticed these last few months. What could the system be? That inspires people. The world's dark. And most people, they don't want to hear more dark. I mean, that's what's kind of fun about the robber baron thing. It's almost cartoonish. And people know we've dealt with this before. But then telling them the positive thing is what galvanizes them to rush the gates. I mean, my big thing in the food system is to put animals back on land. We're going to have a come to Jesus moment as ethanol dies. I mean, cars are moving to hybrids and EVs. That's just a fact. What are we going to do at that moment? It's like watching Wile E. Coyote run off a cliff. Industry's trying to put it into airplanes.
Yes.
You know what I mean? That's what's going on here. And you're like, start thinking big. Like, start thinking like, we didn't get here overnight and we're not going to get to the promised land overnight. But, what is our 30, 40-year vision of the system? Like, that's what I want to focus on. I mean, just real politics for a second. I know a lot of people, when I say we should just junk the modern farm bill, they're worried about SNAP. I promise you, SNAP in the day is just a wage subsidy, a low wage subsidy. Walmart's the most powerful company in America. My hog baron is not real power. He's just a rich Florida man. SNAP will be okay. What's going to happen with SNAP is you're going to have all the Democrats and just a handful of corporate Republicans save the program. You take away Democrat support from crop insurance and it falls apart. Because even in their own party, it's the Koch apparatus thinks it's too gluttonous. It's your classic story of they just got too high on the hog. So much of USA was designed during the Civil War. I mean, it was designed when a good chunk of Americans lived on farms. We live in a different world. A lot of grain production will be robotic soon. Let's start rethinking that. And that's why, I mean, like, even a conversation over what is the role of USDA. I mean, I'm almost at the point now stripping it for parts too. Because like by every metric, it's failed. It's failed farmers. I mean, every dollar you spend, the farmer gets the least amount it's ever been recorded. And so it's just, what are you at this point? Are you just a chamber of commerce for big ag? That's kind of essentially what they've become. Also, just what I've seen in DC is nothing scares an agency more than threatening to cut its budget.
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
lean into the feistiness. Is kind of what I tell people. Like the David versus Goliath, you just have to embrace it. And kind of like use Commissioner Khan as like a role model of like, we know what to do here. I mean, there's a path, and people also crave it. I mean, it's what's incredible is she can walk into a law school right now in America and she packs her up. The kids adore her. They want to be here. She's changing the scholarship. Keep in mind, two foundations help make this possible. And at the same time, too, she shows up in rural Iowa earlier this year, and she gets a small town, hundreds of people show up. In what world do bureaucrats attract that much people? You know what I mean? People crave this right now. They
Yeah.
crave someone
Yeah.
taking on power, someone fighting the good fight, a Teddy Roosevelt type figure. And we have them in this world. It's just, how do we elevate them and how do we confront it head on?
In the book, one of the themes that comes through is the deconstruction of New Deal era policies that were focused on holding power to account more antitrust policy enforcement, development, and more focus on competitiveness. And it took decades for the powers that be to erode that, and you tell that story going from the New Deal Farm Bill to the Wall Street Farm Bill. I wasn't there for the New Deal Farm Bill, very close, but I wasn't there. But I was definitely there for freedom to farm in the 90s. And we spent a good 10 years at EWG trying to dismantle this crazy notion that we should just give farmers money no matter what. There was no Keynesian rhythm left. It was just, you get a check every year. When prices and incomes are high, you get the same check as you get when things are in the basement. And it was just insane. And finally it went away, but what replaced it, the big infusion of money through crop insurance, is its own monster to take on. I have to say, one of the few moments that I realized that maybe we were on the right track was when I would hear from all these Democrats, and I don't want to name them because I don't want to jinx anything, all these Democrats who spent their careers promoting industrial agriculture, commodity crop agriculture, and then they were summarily dumped by their constituents for Republicans who did all of that and more.
Mm-hmm.
I'll name one, may he rest in peace, Charlie Stenholm. And we had lots of disagreements on policy, but, Stenholm was a champion of rural American agriculture from his district in Texas, and he was one of the most powerful players in the Farm Bill debates over decades. I was often against him in these fights, and sure enough, Tom DeLay went to the Farm Bureau and said, "Hey, we need a Republican in Charlie's seat," and the Farm Bureau said, "Yes, sir." So they endorsed a real estate guy for Charlie's seat. Charlie would have been the Secretary of Agriculture. When you remind Democrats of those stories, Dan Glickman's another one who did everything he could for farmers, and boom, he was gone because of, I think, assault weapons, right? That's when you wake up politicians to the reality that they can't buy this loyalty with Farm Bill, with farm subsidy programs. That's not going to get the job done. You really need open reform that reaches out to folks in rural areas who understand, because they're living in it, the power of the system to take jobs out of rural areas, depopulate and eliminate these small towns. Once you start talking about it in that way, I think people say, well, okay, this is somebody who's willing to stand up and fight for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you just said there is the emperor has no clothes. I mean, that's like
Yeah.
they've been so powerful is because they basically have both sides, and they don't
Yeah.
anymore. I mean, they're so one partisan. There's no reason for Democrats to go along with it. That's why I push people to really center on labor, not capital asset managers. And just to add two things to what you were saying is one, I mean, that's kind of why I weirdly think of this moment as very cyclical. Laissez-faire eras happen. You know what I mean? Greed get greedy. They deregulate. They get concentrated. They go too far. It breaks. We regulate. And I just think we're at that moment. We're like a 1928 moment. So, dance while the music's playing. But at the same time, too, think about when that moment comes, what do we do? Well, if we have a 2008 moment, what do we do about the meat industry? What do we do about these cartels? That's what I really want to because you got to do that thinking now. Because when the moments come, they come super fast.
Yep.
And at the same time, too, to your point earlier with Farm Bureau, I mean, talk about an emperor with no clothes. Explain the Iowa Farm Bureau to me. How do you go from a $30 million year operating budget 10 years ago to $100 million when your membership has collapsed? I mean, I just think of that great Mike Wallace 60-minute episodes from 20 years ago, and everything's just gotten worse. I mean,
I was in it.
oh, you were? I didn't. Ken, that's one of
Yeah.
my favorite 60 minutes. I tell everyone to watch it because, first of all, you'll find this funny. They have 2 jets. Every time they go to the Hill, they take their jet from Iowa and they land at Dulles. I have trackers on them. How are you the voice of farmers if you have 2 private jets? That's a whole can of worms that I think foundations should really look into, like digging in. The 2 areas I hear a lot about just rampant corruption is checkoffs and Farm Bureau. There's so much self-dealing because no one's there to keep them honest in these states. When you have $100 million a year operating budget, what's left to buy in Iowa? You know what I mean? First of all, you're buying off the elite, the professional class, but it's cartoonish amount of money for an organization that doesn't really do anything. And so I just think they are part of like the rot of the system. It says so much about where we are is when, they cosplay as farmers. That's like an undercurrent in my book too, is like all these people who say they're farmers are really just capital asset managers. And it's usually the undocumented men who are the actual farmers.
Absolutely. Well, Austin, you've been very generous with your time, and I'll repeat what I've said before. I really hope your book becomes a roadmap for people to think through these issues and think deeper about what is needed to bring the food system back to principles of economic democracy, environmental quality, opportunity in rural areas. And I think your book can really inspire people to do that and take on these deeper, tougher issues. The book is Barron's Money, Power, and the Corruption of America's Food Industry. I've learned a lot from your book, and I've been at this for a while. It's made me think afresh about how to take on some of our advocacy concerns.
Thanks again for having me on, Ken. And as one CRS person to another, the biggest compliment you can give to me is saying that. So I really do appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you, Austin Frerick, for coming on the show. And thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our show notes for additional links for a deeper dive into today's discussion. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, head over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. Now, if you like this episode, send it to a friend who you think would like it too. Environmentalism is all about meeting people where they are. And if you're listening to this, you probably know someone who might be interested in today's episode but doesn't know it yet. My ask is that you send it to that person or as many people as you see fit. Today's episode was produced by the incredible Beth Rowe and Mary Kelly. Our show's theme music is by Moby, and thanks again for listening.